damning report in February, alleging that Canadian police had been abusing Aboriginal women. Joshua Blakeney, Press TV, Calgary.
Let's bring in Joshua Blakeney from Calgary to expand more on this. Joshua Blakeney, great report there. I'd like to get your idea about how Canada's envoy to the UN says Canada is a democracy and that it can clean up its own backyard. It sounds like another country that uses the UN when it wants to, but when it's UN criticizes this country, namely Canada in this case, that it says it's none of your business, we'll clean up our act ourselves. Why is that type of reaction coming instead of a more reconciliatory approach towards the UN and the criticism it has leveled against Canada?
Yeah, hi, Kevin. Obviously, Canada's among those countries that's incessantly lecturing countries such as Iran on human rights and on democracy. And so obviously it's pretty bad for them if it turns out that Canada itself has grave human rights problems, and that is in fact the case. Human Rights Watch earlier this year published a highly explosive, scathing report of the Canadian police containing allegations made by Aboriginal women that police had been raping and abusing them, had used firearms against Aboriginal youth 194 times. Amnesty International have echoed these concerns, stating that Aboriginal women are 5 to 7 times more likely to die from violence than non-Aboriginal women. And yet the government of Canada, rather than addressing these real and legitimate concerns of First Nations peoples, is incessantly trying to delve into the situation in Iran, delve into Cuba's internal affairs, rather than address the internal affairs here in Canada. And so obviously we have somebody ensconced at the UN Human Rights Council named Elissa Goldberg, who is an ardent Zionist. And this is a factor too. To be a Zionist, you have to prescribe to Western exceptionalism. You have to believe the idea that Western countries such as Canada and Britain and the United States are somehow better and more democratic than the other countries. And so when it's time for Canada's universal periodic review and it's pointed out that that's not the case and that Canada has many anti-democratic tendencies, there tends to be this knee-jerk sort of ad hominem approach where the human rights records of the states making the criticisms is spoken of rather than the substance of the criticisms. You know, Saudi Arabia, just because it's a tyranny, could make a correct statement at the United Nations, for example, about Canada's human rights record. But incessantly, whenever criticism is made, it's the fact that X country or Y country is not a democracy, quote unquote, that's focused on rather than the substance of the criticisms. Obviously, also Canada is a sort of jewel in the Zionist crown because Israel is trying to destabilize the Middle East currently and is wanting the US to shift from giving petrodollars to Israel's enemies in the Middle East to giving petrodollars to Canada. Canada, where I live here in Alberta, has the 3rd largest oil reserves in the world. And so there's an attempt to wean the United States onto Canadian oil. And the fact that Aboriginal peoples are often voicing concerns about being displaced and dispossessed as a result of the very dirty tar sands oil developments here is inconvenient to that Zionist agenda. And so Canada's very important for the global Zionist agenda too, of making sure that petrodollars go here to Zionist influence Canada rather than going to the Middle East. And Aboriginal peoples are the ones who are suffering because of these oil developments in this country. So there's many incentives for Zionists, such as Canada's ambassador to the UN Human Rights Council, to want to try and whitewash the suffering of Aboriginal peoples in particular and focus on external alleged human rights abuses in other countries. And this is to the detriment of First Nations people. As I say, a recent Human Rights Watch report claimed the police were raping Aboriginal women, and yet Elissa Goldberg claims that we have a legal system that can rectify this internally without supranational organizations.
Thank you very much for that. Joshua Blakeney, a correspondent there from Calgary. On to France. More bad news for the French economy as Paris unveils its budget draft for next year. France's public debt is set to hit new record highs of over 95% of the GDP in 2014. That's far higher than initial estimates. The new budget is aimed at cutting $15 billion